Okay, I think we have a sizable audience, so maybe we can kind of kick things off. So let me start by just saying good evening to everyone India time. Good afternoon to those of us in the UK, and good morning to people in the US. So we have people from multiple time zones here. And thank you for joining us for this discussion, which, for everyone's information, is also being recorded and live streamed. So thank you for joining us for this discussion on the state of play of global climate finance negotiations. My name is Aman Srivastav. I'm a fellow at the Sustainable Futures Collaborative, and I jointly coordinate our work on climate policy with my colleague Ishwaran, who's on this call as well. And I have the privilege of hosting three distinguished speakers this evening. Again, India time, so I'll just keep saying evening. And I will just introduce them in about 2 minutes from now. So the purpose of this workshop is, as most of you know, COP29, the climate conference, is about to begin in Azerbaijan in about 2 weeks, and climate finance is going to be a big agenda item this year. Specifically, a decision is expected on something called the new Collective Quantified Goal, which is meant to replace the 2009 commitment by developed countries to provide 100 billion in annual climate finance by 2020. Unlike that previous 100 billion commitment, the NCQG, as it's abbreviated, is supposed to take into account the needs and priorities of developing countries and is seen as a symbol of trust and commitment between developed and developing countries. So it's perhaps unsurprising that it's being quite closely watched. Um, and at this point, there are various estimates of what those needs of developing countries might be, but they broadly range between about $500 billion to $2.5 trillion per year by 2030. India's own submission to the UNFCCC, for instance, suggested a minimum quantum for the NCQG of about $1 trillion per year, composed largely of grants and concessional finance. That being said, the amount is not yet determined, and that's something that is expected to be announced at COP after the negotiations are concluded. What we want to do here in these next 45 minutes is discuss this NCQG, as well as other elements of broader climate finance negotiations, and to better understand what sort of decisions we can expect, how far it might go in meeting these stated needs, and the role of the NCQG within the overall state of play of climate diplomacy. So that's in the next 45 minutes or so. We'll then try and keep about 15 to 20 minutes towards the end for the speakers to address questions from the audience. And to our audience, please feel free to type out any questions you may have into the chat box at any time, preferably indicating the speaker to which the question is directed if possible. We'll try and answer a few of the easier ones in the chat box, and we'll leave a few to discuss during the Q&A session that we have at the end of these discussions. And do bear in mind that we may not be able to address all the questions due to time constraints, but we'll try our best to address as many as possible. So with that, let me maybe go ahead and introduce the speakers. So we're joined by three people this evening. The first is Jonathan Bainan, who is a senior policy associate at the Center for Global Development's European program, focusing on climate finance and development. Jonathan has spent 26 years with DFID and FCDO, including as senior economist in the Energy, Climate, and Environment Directorate. He's also worked in a variety of other DFID roles, which have included secondments to the European Commission and various country postings in Africa. Prior to that, he was a research economist at Oxford University and an ODI fellow in Botswana. Our second speaker is Avantika Goswami, who is a program manager at the Center for Science and Environment. She has over 10 years of experience across the public, private, and nonprofit sectors. And at CSE, she leads research and advocacy spanning climate finance, mitigation ambition, carbon markets, trade, and UNFCCC negotiations. She's also a member of the political coordination group of Climate Action Network. And before this, she's worked with the Earth Institute in New York, the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, as well as stints with Bloomberg Associates and Aon Hewitt. And lastly, and not least at all, we're joined by Joe Thwaites, who is a senior advocate at the Natural Resources Defense Council, where he works on international climate policy to scale up funding for developing countries, align finance with the Paris Agreement's goals, and reform international financial institutions to better support climate action. Prior to NRDC, he worked on climate finance at the World Resources Institute for 8 years. And he's also worked for non-governmental organizations on European Union climate and energy policy and on conflict prevention and disarmament policy. So thank you, all three of you, for being here. And first of all, if you do see any questions in the chat box during the course of the next 45 minutes that you would like to respond to via chat during the panel, please feel free to do so. And though we'll try and save at least a few questions for the Q&A round that follows. But with that, let's maybe dive in with a round of opening questions and introductory comments, speaking specifically about the NCQG. Does that sound okay with everyone? Yeah, great, thank you. So maybe I'll start with you, Jonathan, since we've been speaking a little bit about the NCQG and what it means and how it builds on the 100 billion commitment and so on. Could you maybe just give us a sense of what quantum and what sort of timelines we're looking at, and which country groupings are likely to be contributors to this quantum that is decided? And maybe a related question is, whatever expectations we might have about this quantum, how might they change based on what happens with the US election outcomes? So over to you, Jonathan.
Thanks, Aman, and good day, everybody, wherever you may be. No, thanks for the question. I think these issues around quantum size and contributor base in particular are probably the two most contentious aspects of the NCQG, and it would be fair to say that the sides are far apart at the moment. I say sides, developed and developing, although I personally don't like that categorization much. But developing countries argue that developed countries are responsible. They have both a moral and a legal responsibility to provide more climate finance, and the sums required are currently woefully inadequate and should be much greater than the existing $100 billion target. Developed countries, on the other hand, say the world has changed massively since the original agreement and set of contributor countries was established, and there should be a broadening of the contributor base. I think both sides have a point, and there's no question that the growing body of analysis trying to quantify climate finance needs suggest numbers, as you said, Aman, of $1 trillion or more in many cases. At the same time, it's worth remembering 40% of all greenhouse gas emissions since 1850 have been emitted in the last 30 years, and more than 2/3 of that from developing countries. In fact, if you look at the greenhouse gas data, I think the current set of Annex 2 climate finance providers are responsible for around 37% of total emissions since 1850. So the world has changed a lot, and that's why there is such tension between these two parties. What's interesting is that in the draft negotiating text for the NCQG, there is language referring to the quantum, and it essentially embraces the full range of options that have been tabled, ranging from a floor of $100 billion, which was the US's position, to I think 2 trillion is the largest number I spotted in there. So everything is open on that point. In terms of time frame, there are references to over the period 2025 to 29. Elsewhere, it refers to by 2030 and through to 2040, or by 2035 and through to 2040. So that topic is very much open as well. What I found interesting in the draft NCQG text is it does make reference to the contributor base. And again, there are a range of options there, but it does at least throw this question up into the open. Quite a lot of work has been done in the past looking at the analytical framework for identifying who might contribute. A lot of it has been focused on the existing set of Annex 2 providers, the 23 developed countries, and all of them show that the US should be providing much, much more, 40% plus. What's interesting is that those approaches, if you extend them to all countries in the world, they tend to come up with a share of maybe 50% coming from non-traditional donors. These are based on looking at countries' shares of cumulative emissions and shares of total GNI and taking the average of the two. We've done some work ourselves with a slightly different approach, which looks at aggregate emissions, but also looks at per capita income and comes up with much smaller numbers for developing countries or non-Annex 2 countries. We were looking at a range of different scenarios, different measures of emissions, different measures of income, different cutoff dates, and we thought 20 to 30% coming from non-traditional donors would be a realistic target. But this is absolutely up for discussion. It's a very hot point. The criteria that are suggested in the NCQG text cover things like cumulative historical emissions, per capita income, but also cumulative per capita emissions. And what's interesting, we've done some analysis just looking at what sets of countries might be included as new contributors. And the main ones are China, not surprisingly perhaps, most of the Gulf states, South Korea, Singapore, Israel, and a number of what one would describe as former Eastern European economies. And there does seem to be some consensus growing around that as a core group of potentially new countries. Whether that materializes or not, I don't know. I think there's a huge amount to play for when it comes to the negotiations. One point I should emphasize, and that was certainly our own analysis, concluded that the collective responsibility of the poorest countries, and you can include amongst that all your low-income countries, your lower middle-income countries, including crucially India, your LDCs, and your SIDS, which is more than 100 countries in total. Our own analysis suggests that collectively they would be responsible for less than 2% of any climate finance share, and I would like to see them just exempted altogether, to be honest. There are some exemptions listed in this draft text which are slightly less generous than that, but whether that materializes, I don't know. There is a lot to play for, that much is for sure. On your last question about outcome of the US elections, the signs are not positive. Were Trump to win, it's likely that aid in general will be cut and climate finance will be cut in particular. So in that sense, there aren't great grounds for optimism. I'm a development person. I have rose-tinted spectacles. I try and look at the positive side of things. And I do recall when Trump won in 2016, there were fears as to what the global reaction would be. And in practice, it seemed as if much of the rest of the world doubled down on their climate commitments, at least in terms of trying to reduce emissions. So the worst fears were not realized. There is also a body of analysis that suggests that it is in the interests of developed countries to help pay for more rapid transition in developing countries. And those interests might outweigh the reduced likelihood of an increased contribution from the US. So while I think from purely narrow climate finance perspective, one candidate would be preferable to another, or would not be lost, would be my attempt to put a positive spin on that. Back to you, Anand.
Great, thank you, Jonathan. That really lays out kind of the huge variety of options we're faced with, but also kind of ends with a rosy picture, which is kind of heartening to kind of stop at. And maybe I'll come to Joe now, because Joe, I know you had some thoughts on this quantum, but also going beyond what might be the amounts and who might be the contributor countries. Could you speak a little bit more about whatever this quantum might end up being, what might be the strategies for realizing that amount? And given that the experience with the 100 billion commitment has been less than ideal, what sort of accountability measures exist to ensure that this new quantum is indeed new and additional?
Thank you, Aman, and thank you to the Sustainable Futures Collaborative for organizing this discussion. It is really important and timely. We are less than 2 weeks away from the COP29 beginning, where the NCQG is due to be finalized and agreed. And as you heard, and as Jonathan mentioned, the expert analysis is quite clear that developing countries' total investment needs for addressing climate change and meeting the Paris Agreement commitments are in the trillions of dollars per year. And there's been a range of analysis taking those overall global amounts as to how much should be supported internationally, including from public and private sources. But even those kind of figures, and one of the most prominent ones is the Independent High-Level Expert Group on Climate Finance, led by Vera Songwe and Nick Stern, and found that of the total investment need of $2.4 trillion a year, around $1 trillion of that would need to come from international sources, both public and private. These are big and serious amounts. And last week, together with experts from ODI, German Watch, and ECHO, we published a model that was trying to sort of look at how you get from where we are right now, international flows under the auspices of the old 100 billion goal were about $116 billion from public and private mobilized finance in 2022. How you get from there to those much larger sums that have been discussed. And so we published a model that allows users to adjust various different parameters and explore different ways that international climate finance could be scaled up. There's been a lot of discussion about the structure of the goal, including the idea that there might be different layers, that you could have an outer layer that captures those, the full amounts needed, the multiple trillions in overall climate investment, and then as a subset, an inner layer that captures the amount of international support, which could include public finance provided, but also private finance mobilized for developing countries only. Our analysis focused on that inner layer, on the international support element, because I think that is probably the most important thing when we talk about quantum. That's the one that I think we'll need the most negotiating. The outer layer, those amounts, are, especially if it's an investment goal, it's more indicative. It's more sort of setting an overall context rather than the goal that countries will be sort of held to detailed account for. So we were really looking at, what are the potential sources that could meet that in a support layer. Some of the funding is going to come from the same sources that have delivered the 100 billion goal. So bilateral development agencies, multilateral development banks, the multilateral climate funds, as well as private finance that gets mobilized by these public sources of funding. But one of the things that became really clear as we were building out the model is that even if you have significant growth to these traditional sources, quote unquote traditional sources of climate finance, we will not get to the scale of funding laid out in many of the needs estimates. So then we started to look at, well, one of the things we were doing was sort of going, well, if you were to, double, triple, even quadruple traditional bilateral flows, it would get you to a few hundred billion, sorry, potentially, but it won't get you, past 500 billion even. And so then we were sort of looking at, well, what are the other options? And the key thing with all of these is that they are going to require political will. They're going to require citizen support. But it is, it can be possible to mobilize more finance more quickly to meet the moment. And some of those mechanisms include greater deployment of innovative sources such as levies on polluting sectors like oil and gas, shipping and aviation, additional reform of international financial institutions like the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank so that they're bigger and better at financing climate, concerted efforts to change domestic perspectives in contributor countries towards provision of international funding. And Jonathan sort of mentioned a little bit about, setting out why it's in developed countries' own interest to contribute more internationally, because I think it is. There's a lot of good arguments for that. And then using a mix of carrots and sticks to better mobilize private finance. And so all of these have significant potential to scale finance and make higher amounts possible. But then there's also, the quality and consistency and the reporting issues that you mentioned, and that has been one of the big challenges in assessing progress towards the 100 billion. So alongside that overall scaling up, it will be important to think about quality and allocation. One way of doing that is to just better define the new goal, perhaps including more qualitative criteria or even sub-targets that could drive funding to the areas that's needed and make it easier to track delivery. And then on that issue of tracking, there is a new system that was negotiated under the Paris Agreement for how countries report on efforts, including on finance provision, mobilization, and also finance needed and received. And for the first time, all countries will report every 2 years using the same guidelines. And that reporting, the first set of reports, are due this year. So this process could hopefully lead to an improvement in the consistency and quality of climate finance reporting. But there'll probably need to be some revisions in light of what's agreed for the new goal. And those reporting guidelines are in any case up for review in 2028. So I think there's actually a nice alignment already to make some revisions. There's also been a suggestion of maybe creating additional reporting and tracking systems, potentially more frequent than every 2 years, because that creates quite a lot of lag time. But it is a challenge for a lot of contributor countries to get all that data together. I mean, it's a challenge for everyone when they're doing reporting, and we hear that a lot in the negotiations. And then the other idea that I've heard discussed is particularly if there was to be a deal around the contributor base and changing that, potentially needing an independent entity that has the trust of all countries to do some assessment of progress towards the goal. Because currently the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, has been the organization that developed countries have tasked to do the analysis of progress towards the 100 billion. That's not been without critique. And I think if you had additional contributors, particularly those that aren't OECD members, I'm not sure they would necessarily want the OECD to be the organization that does that analysis. So I think potentially, getting a group of organizations together, the equivalent of the OECD for developing countries or for other contributors potentially, and working together, or creating a totally new entity, or finding an existing entity. So that's one of the final things on transparency, but I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Joe. That was incredibly comprehensive. And I'm going to, in the next 2 questions, I'm going to dissect your 2 sub-responses a little bit more. So in the first sub-response, of course, you were speaking about the different kind of levels or layers of climate finance, and how if you look at the innermost layer, that bilateral finance, even if it kind of scales up, may not be sufficient to meet some of those stated needs that run into the trillions, and that we'll need to rely on other sources. You mentioned MDBs, private finance, and so on and so forth. And I think we even have a question in the chat box about the scope of public-private partnerships, if anybody would like to tackle that. But building on that point that you made, I guess I'll turn to you now, Avantika, with a question, just taking forward what Joe said. When we're speaking about the different layers of climate finance that might be within this NCQG quantum and whether they're sufficient or not, and assuming that innermost bilateral finance layer may not be sufficient, I'd be curious to hear from you, how can the outcome, whatever the outcome might be, how can it meaningfully address the needs of developing countries without increasing the debt burdens of the recipient countries? And do developing countries have a role here in making this outcome more meaningful?
Sure. So thank you, Aman and SFC, for inviting me to this discussion. It's very timely. And in fact, CSC just published our position paper on the NCQG. It's called Show Us the Money, very provocatively. So please do read it. But I think the question of meeting climate finance needs without increasing indebtedness is extremely crucial. For us, the quantum is definitely a critical aspect. It has to be in line with needs estimations and has to keep evolving because needs are constantly evolving. But the quality of finance is, in our view, equally important. And a subset of this is the question of debt and the role of debt creating finance. And maybe I'll just set a little bit of context in terms of why debt is such a big question mark in the NCQG debate. So global figures show that in terms of overall climate finance flows from developed to developing countries, close to 70% of those flows are in the form of debt or loans. And this has increasingly become a very sore point in the multilateral discussions, particularly the negotiations at COP. Because essentially, when you have market rate debt, particularly, or debt of any kind, that's tagged as climate finance, at a moral level, first of all, many have argued that it doesn't really constitute climate finance because you're expected to pay that back with interest. So climate finance was originally conceived as a form of reparations from developed to developing countries. But secondly, on a more real economy scale, there are developing countries who are facing a crushing debt burden. And this is extremely prominent, particularly for LDCs, SIDS countries, less so for countries like India, but still a major problem for the developing world. And CSE did a piece of analysis last year in a report that we called Beyond Climate Finance. And our analysis found that out of 16 low and middle income countries, out of a subset of low and middle income countries, 16 of them are facing debt servicing costs in a particular year that exceed the cost of achieving their NDCs in a particular year. So their debt burden is essentially hindering their ability to achieve their climate goals. In a sense, it was kind of a rough and tumble calculation. The debt relief for a green and inclusive recovery project estimates that 47 emerging market and developing economies are projected to default on their loans if they prioritize investments in globally agreed upon climate and development goals. So there's plenty of data out there to suggest that the sovereign debt burden is becoming a huge hindrance to the ability of countries to take on more climate ambition. And that's where the debt question is very central to the NCQG debate, because if we have an outcome on the NCQG that prioritizes market rate debt, most of it coming in, let's say, through the private sector, it will worsen this debt burden. The other angle of this particular equation is the question of the cost of capital. I think more and more analysis now is being done to show that the interest rates on debt or the returns on equity expected from developing economies are much higher than they are for advanced economies, particularly when you apply this to green technologies, which are more nascent and are emerging technologies. These rates are even higher. So essentially, countries may want to access finance, but the cost of capital is simply prohibitive, particularly in the case of green technologies. So these considerations, the cost of capital as well as the debt burden, have to inform the NCQG outcome to ensure that the mistakes of the past aren't repeated. And this has been a very clear demand from the G77 and China bloc, from a number of other developing countries, to really emphasize that we need the NCQG to be structured around, as much as possible, grant-based financing or highly concessional finance, so as not to worsen these prohibiting factors and prevent access to finance. Now, the question is, what can actually be done about this? And this is where I have no easy answers, maybe more concerns and questions than answers, but definitely I can shed some light and some context. So there is, of course, as Joe highlighted, this emerging discussion around the private finance, private sector coming in and kind of constituting this investment layer of the NCQG. The problem is that the private sector has not been known to invest in infrastructure in developing economies, particularly for climate purposes. The data on this shows that this has been underwhelming, and this finance is likely to be, at least to a large extent, debt-oriented, which is not ideal for a lot of these countries who are under a debt burden. So we also don't know whether the UNFCCC has the capacity or even the jurisdiction to actually exercise any kind of accountability mechanism over private investors. So how do we track these flows? How do we ensure that they are being offered, the finance is being offered at concessional levels? There's a lot of questions on the private finance aspect. So then we come to the question of bilateral aid, and bilateral aid has been found to be offered on concessional terms, lower than market rate terms for the most part. But bilateral aid is being demanded at a time when aid budgets are being cut by developed countries around the world, or existing development finance flows, there's an increasing risk that they are being tagged as climate, and there isn't essentially new money, there isn't additionality. Money is being redirected from one pot to another. Moreover, there are multiple competing priorities. We know that wars and military spending are huge priorities for a number of G7 and affiliated countries right now. You also have countries offering huge, developed countries offering huge domestic subsidies for green industry, as is being seen through the US IRA or the carbon capture subsidy being offered in the UK. So there's all of these competing priorities for bilateral aid from public government budgets in developed countries. So it's a little unclear how much more of that will really be offered at this point, given the political climate. If you talk about MDBs, there's a lot of support for the MDBs to direct some amount of concessional lending, though most of the concessional lending is reserved for the lowest income countries. But the MDB question also faces a number of complications at this point. Some additional lending has been unlocked at this point through the capital adequacy framework reforms, but other very innovative so-called proposals have been actually rejected. So recently there was a proposal to rechannel special drawing rights to the AFDB and the Inter-American Development Bank. And this would have unlocked additional financing from these particular MDBs. But this was rejected by the European Central Bank for very specific domestic legal reasons, and just an overall unwillingness to take on more risk. So proposals like this are put on the table, but then they are rejected. So that makes the MDB question a little more complicated as well. So no easy answers to where non-debt creating additional concessional finance will come in, but the imperative for it is no less important. The economist Avinash Persaud has put forward a proposal to increase capital flows to developing countries by reducing currency risk for investments. There should be momentum behind proposals like that. And of course, as previous speakers have mentioned, there are estimates of how much additional financing, fossil fuel levies on shipping, aviation, wealth taxes can actually unleash. Some great analysis has been done by Oil Change International and ActionAid on these issues, but still remains an open question on where this kind of non-debt creating finance can really come in. I'll stop here.
Great. Thanks, Avantika. And I take what you said. There are no easy answers, but I think even having a broad set of perspectives is helpful in kind of thinking through some of these issues. Maybe I'll come back to Jonathan with some questions looking at the broader context around the NCQG. And this draws from what Joe said about when he was speaking about the accounting frameworks and some of the challenges that have, that accounting frameworks and reporting entities such as the OECD have faced. So this comes to the heart of some long-standing disagreements that have existed between developed and developing countries on the definitions of climate finance, the amounts, the instruments, the sources, whether it's public or private, et cetera, et cetera. So Jonathan, in the more than 26 years that you've worked in this space, do you see the climate finance landscape as having meaningfully evolved over these past 15 or 20 years? And what do you see in terms of overall progress going forward? Do you see a path for some sort of convergence, some sort of reconciliation, or yeah, it's a very open question. And I realize it's not an easy one, but open to your thoughts.
I'll do my best to answer, but it depends really on what you mean by meaningful. I think in short, I would say, yes, there has been some evolution, but nowhere near enough. I think would be my main point. What has struck me in the course of the last few years, and following in particular the climate finance debate and the negotiation preparation for the NCQG, is that there is at least a lot more recognition that sums entailed need to be based on better analysis of needs, and in some cases, even of justice, rather than the $100 billion figure, which was pretty much plucked out of thin air as a big sounding figure way back in 2009. So I think that's, that is a positive. Although, as I said, and I think Joe and Avantika have also implied, whether we get close to achieving the kinds of sums that most analysts acknowledge is appropriate, we're some way short of that. But at least there is a stronger recognition that needs, and to some extent justice, need to come into play. Secondly, and perhaps related, the fact that the loss and damage fund has been established and launched is, I think, a significant evolution and a positive. When the sort of that door was kicked ajar, I think at COP26 in Glasgow, and then quite rapidly we got agreement to the establishment of a fund, and then the fund itself. Now those have been significant improvements, but, and of course there is a big but, the amounts of money so far committed are trivial, and the vast majority of those funds are just coming from existing climate finance commitments. So while it is a positive evolution, there is a long, long way to go before that becomes materially significant and will begin to address the scale of the challenge that is only going to get bigger in years to come. The third point I would say is that, yes, the original reference to climate finance in the UNFCCC and in the Paris Agreement, it's a very broad definition. Indeed, there isn't really a definition of what climate finance counts. And I am at least encouraged that there is greater focus on trying to clarify what climate finance is. Avantika made the very important and good point about emphasizing more on grant-based aid and concessional support. And I think it comes out, in fact, in the draft NCQG text. There are lots of reference to grant equivalence. Now, that to me is exactly the way in which we should be trying to assess the provision of climate finance. Certainly for the publicly provided element of whatever total ends up being agreed. Whether that materialized at the end of the day, I'm not overly optimistic. But at least there is a much greater recognition that grant equivalence is the basis on which sums should be assessed and amounts provided. And it strikes me that if we look at the current set of climate finance providers, there is a massive disparity in the terms in which that climate finance is offered. A number of countries provide it essentially in entirely grant terms. Others, the grant is much more loan based, and the grant equivalent measure of that support might only be 10% of the total. So if there's a greater focus on grant equivalent as our metric for both quantifying needs but also committing and promising money, we would end up with a much fairer way of assessing different contributions. And I think that is really, really important, because some countries are getting away with murder at the moment. Let me put it that way. I think it's also, and I meant to say this at the beginning, it's also very important to acknowledge that a number of unofficial providers, China, for example, provide substantial amounts of climate finance, which are just not being recorded or reported. And I think we need to find a way, and ways are being found in which that is increasingly acknowledged. The grant equivalence point is still relevant there, because the vast majority of Chinese climate finance, welcome though it is still provided in loan terms, and they have a fairly low grant equivalence ratio. The fourth area I would say, well, I think there is some progress, and Joe alluded to this already, is in the context of the enhanced transparency framework, the basis on which countries report information the climate finance provided. And the fact that this new framework exists and will be reviewed so further improvements can be introduced, I think is encouraging. It's a positive evolution, but there is still a long way to go. There isn't yet, at least my understanding is that there isn't yet a single agreed framework for defining and reporting climate finance. And while providers are now being obliged to be clearer in terms of the basis on which they are reporting their finance, it's still going to involve a fair bit of effort for analysts, internal and external, to try and work out what these mean on a like-for-like basis. So there's a way to go on that front. One other area that I think is, again, we are seeing some positive evolution is in the focus on vulnerable countries, and to some extent the creation of the Loss and Damage Fund is a reflection of that. The Paris Agreement is peppered with references to the needs of the most vulnerable, and quite a lot of work has gone into trying to be more specific about identifying which those countries are, that's extraordinarily difficult. And I think we will forever end up with a sort of fairly broad-based collection of countries that will be included within that. I think it's fair to say that currently nowhere near enough money is being targeted at those which are most vulnerable to climate change. I'm hopeful that there is some beginnings of a change in that. So there is some positive evolution, but a long way to go. And then the last point I would make here is, and this has struck me, having had a long period of time before I started working on climate change and climate finance, working more broadly as a development economist. We went through a long period of painful lesson learning in terms of what works and what doesn't work in the provision of official development assistance more broadly. And a whole set of aid effectiveness principles were established to try and improve the effectiveness of aid. And my concern is that the climate finance arena has been very slow to learn those lessons. So there's a huge amount of fragmentation. Disbursement rates are very slow. It's definitely not locally led. It's not really based on government-owned plans for addressing their climate challenges. And so there's an awful lot to learn from that broader literature on aid effectiveness. Potentially we're beginning to see some green shoots on that, but I think that's one area where there is an awful lot that we still need to do. And I was going to say something on the role of the MDBs, but Avantika has largely covered that. I think there is the point is, and it links also to the provision of private finance, where I think it's absolutely right that the focus needs to be on public finance and assessed in grant equivalent terms, but private finance will always and necessarily be an important part of the total package. And I do think there's a growing recognition of the role of the multilateral institutions in trying to help mobilize some of that private money. And I think that's a positive thing. I think part of the reason why private money is not necessarily going in anything like the quantities required or to the places where it is most needed is partly around to perceptions of risk. And I emphasize the word perceptions of risk because I think there's plenty of analysis suggesting that actually the risks entailed in investing in some of these countries are not as great as is widely perceived. And I think the MDBs have a particularly valuable role in playing in trying to overcome some of those concerns that are inhibiting private flows that will necessarily play at least some role in addressing this problem. Back to you.
Thanks, Jonathan. That was extremely useful, especially the points about learning lessons from the development aid experience. And it's also heartening to kind of hear that the landscape of climate finance, the definitional issues, etc., have evolved a little bit over time, not sufficiently, but certainly to some extent. Maybe I'll kind of come back to Avantika now, and this is kind of an extension of the previous question I asked you, Avantika, but it also draws on what Jonathan and Joe both mentioned. I mean, Jonathan's mentioned the loss and damage fund a couple of times. Jonathan and Joe both mentioned MDBs. Jonathan spoke about non-traditional sources of finance, such as China and so on. I think what I draw from that is that there's a lot happening on the climate finance front from various different channels. And my question to you is NCQG the most important agenda item to focus on in the middle of all of this? Is it deserving of the attention that it's getting? And is this where future momentum on further climate action will come from?
Sure. Thanks, Aman, and thanks to the other speakers for your great comments. The short answer coming from a civil society organization that's an observer organization in the UNFCCC is yes. And I'll tell you why. But before that, I think it's important to separate what's happening within the UNFCCC universe and the politics of that, and what's happening in, it's probably not right to say the real world, but the world beyond, and I would say maybe in bilateral groupings or in domestic politics or in smaller plurilateral groupings like the G20 and the BRICS. So outside of the UNFCCC, the conversations tend to be quite different. If you look at the question, the conversations that are being had domestically in India, for example, you don't really have these binaries between, how much money should come from the private sector, how much should come from the public sector. It's a different universe. And in domestic strategies, for example, the private sector is already playing quite a leading role in some countries. For example, in India, a lot of the renewable energy investment is being driven by the private sector, and that's being actively encouraged. So it's a different kind of politics occurring there. And I think data for overall climate finance flows, not just from developed to developing countries, but even what countries, advanced economies are investing among themselves and all of that. The data shows that about 76%, this is from CPI, 76% of global climate finance was raised domestically. There's a lot of action happening outside the UNFCCC. The world isn't kind of waiting for an NCQG necessarily. But does that make the NCQG process less important? Maybe one way to look at it is in terms of quantum. That 1 trillion that's being demanded is probably a drop in the ocean, given that global climate finance flows are higher and the outside trends are bigger. But what makes this particular decision item and this issue within the COP process crucial is that it has the potential to firstly correct some of the past wrongs, the lessons from the non-delivery of the 100 billion, the lack of the definition, the lack of accountability, the high incidence of debt-based finance. So it's an opportunity to course correct some of that. And it's also an opportunity to kind of create a precedent for how climate ambition is going to be enabled going forward. So we have an opportunity here to create a sort of framework. So let's assume for a second we're all very cynical and we probably have all kinds of reservations about what's going to happen in Baku. But the point is that in an ideal scenario, if the developing world is able to get most of its demands met in terms of a quantum, in terms of a clear structure with sub-goals for mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage, more public finance, less of a role for private finance, kind of a supporting role, all of that creates a framework for how our climate goals in the developing world could be met in the coming decades. And I think that is the kind of political win that the NCQG represents. So in terms of quantum and in terms of the space, it's kind of its own thing, its own mini universe. But the political significance of achieving that win is monumental, and it's been a long fight. I mean, 2009 was when this 100 billion arbitrary figure was put on the table, but even before that, finance was recognized in the convention. So the 100 billion was not negotiated. It was arbitrarily placed top down by developed countries, imposed onto developing countries who disagreed with it even back then. But this is an opportunity to actually achieve a political win that is actually listening to the voices of the global south and creating some sort of an enabling framework for climate ambition, because we know that climate ambition has to be ramped up. For us in India, today, India is contributing only about 7.5% of annual emissions, but this is going to grow, and we desperately need to decarbonize, but we need the means of implementation for that. And instead of being stuck in that kind of loop of, can't take on mitigation ambition without finance and, going round and round, this is a great opportunity to kind of put that finance framework in place and then enable this climate ambition that's going to be demanded of the developing world, where energy consumption is going to rise, emissions are going to rise. And this is really an opportunity to do some of that course correction. So from my perspective, for the multilateral climate space, this is the most important issue, and it's reflective everywhere. For some of us COP people, I mean, maybe, I don't know if Joe is also deeply involved in COP processes, but for some of us COP people who follow all of the other negotiation tracks, finance is a sticking point everywhere. The adaptation discussions are completely hamstrung right now by the finance question, the adaptation finance gap. The mitigation work program it's completely paralyzed at this point because developing countries argue that we can't take on more mitigation ambition without financial support ambition. The loss and damage fund, of course, had finance at its core, and now the NCQG. So finance is kind of the sore point everywhere, without which we're not being able to kind of move ahead and kind of break these deadlocks. So yes, I think not a very short response, but it is the most important issue in multilateral negotiations, and a failure would be quite catastrophic for the future of climate deliberations.
No, thank you, Avantika. That's really helpful. So huge political salience, and of course, taking your closing point that finance is everywhere and finance is a sticking point everywhere. Maybe that's where I'll kind of come back to Joe with my next question, which is, given everything that's happening on finance, the loss and damage fund, the mitigation work program, the global goal on adaptation, Article 2.1c, MDB reform, etc., finance being a sticking point in all of these places. Joe, could you maybe just summarize for the audience quickly, what is the state of play on these other finance negotiations outside of the NCQG? Particularly in the prevailing economic and geopolitical climate. And I asked this noting that there's also a question in the chat box about loss and damage finance. So please do keep looking at the questions in the chat box as well.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think I agree with the others that the NCQG is, and I don't think it's at all controversial. I think every government would say that the NCQG is the most important finance outcome that we need to be focused on from COP29. But it is definitely important to keep an eye on other finance tracks. And one of the things that is both a point of sort of a little bit of bemusement, but also some real stress, is that since the Paris Agreement was adopted and then entered into force, the finance agenda items have basically doubled, if not more than doubled, because for everything that you used to have where it was just an agenda item under the convention or under the Kyoto Protocol, the meeting of the parties to the Kyoto Protocol or the conference of the parties to the convention, you now have agenda items for the conference of the parties, as the meeting of the parties of the Paris Agreement. And so whereas before you would just have guidance to the Green Climate Fund from the COP, you now also have guidance to the Green Climate Fund from the CMA. And for a lot of those things, they just do exactly the same decision. They just copy paste, and it's fine. But there are some interesting differences, and so a lot more agenda items than in the past, and the number of finance negotiators is more or less stable, especially for some of the smaller countries, and not just from developed countries. I mean, the negotiator from Switzerland often sort of reminds everyone that her ministerial team, or the team within her ministry that worked on climate finance, is like 3 or 4 people, and so it's an awful lot to handle in terms of reporting and everything. But a few of the things I would sort of highlight. So first of all, yes, as you mentioned, loss and damage. The fund for responding to loss and damage is taking its first steps to operationalize. And there's been a lot of criticism about the process that's followed, and the desire for it to move faster. But I do, as someone who's spent a lot of time working on the Green Climate Fund, I think the process for the fund for responding to loss and damage is moving far faster than any previous climate fund has ever moved in terms of getting set up in the first few years. The GCF was created in 2010. It didn't receive its first pledges until 2014, and it didn't start approving funding until 2015. So there was 5 years basically. The Loss and Damage Fund was the governing instrument. Well, the idea of creating a fund was approved in Sharm el Sheikh at COP27. The governing instrument of the fund was adopted a year later. That's similar timeline to the Green Climate Fund. But then the pledges came in immediately as soon as it was adopted. And the fund is now working to get up and running. I think the aim was to approve initial projects by the end of this year or early next year. That's phenomenally fast when it comes to multilateral institutions and multilateral climate funds, certainly. So I think that, you know, we do need to see more pledges. We need to see that funding actually get approved. But I think, and obviously, you know, the urgency is huge. That's why there has been this real push to get it going quickly. But I think on loss and damage, there is a lot of movement there. It's important to keep the pressure up. But that's one thing to look at. On adaptation finance, there was a goal agreed in Glasgow at COP26 to double, developed countries agreed to double their provision of adaptation finance from 2019 levels, which is about $20 billion by 2025. So that's around $40 billion. As of 2022, total adaptation finance from developed to developing countries was 32.4 billion. Unfortunately, the OECD number doesn't disaggregate how much was private finance. My suspicion is not very much of it. It's quite hard to get the private sector to invest in adaptation. So I think, you know, that 32 hopefully is an indication that they are quite well on their way to reaching the 40 billion doubling goal. But, you know, definitely not a time to be complacent. The other thing to say is to look out for is pledges to the adaptation specific funds like the Adaptation Fund and the Least Developed Countries Fund. With NRDC, we created a pledge tracker last year because we realized that some of the funds, you know, weren't the quickest at updating their own websites. So we will hope to do that again, and you can sort of check in at least for the initial tally, and then once the official secretariats have, you know, caught up, then we sort of refer back to them. But the Adaptation Fund last year set a fundraising goal of $300 million, and it fell short, getting less than 200 million. So they've got the same target this year, and hopefully they can meet it. It would be a bad signal for countries to fall short in meeting that need for the second year in a row. And then the third thing I want to talk about is Article 2.1c. So this is one of the 3 long-term goals of the Paris Agreement. So you have the 1.52 degree temperature targets, the goal of increasing the ability to adapt and fostering climate resilience. And then you have the finance long-term goal, which is making finance flows or aligning finance flows with low emissions and climate resilient development pathways, and making consistent, I think, is the official language. And that one, I think, of the 3 has become the most stuck. The temperature goals obviously have the NDC ambition process, as well as the mitigation work program. The adaptation goal has the global goal on adaptation. 2.1c so far only has a dialogue. So countries have only agreed to talk about it. There's no requirement to have any kind of outcomes or delivery. Developed countries have pushed for 2.1c or for elements of 2.1c to be part of the NCQG. There may be some potential to incorporate little bits about broader finance alignment. The sort of, 2.1c is essentially everything, making all finance consistent. So, it depends. There's a way that I could see of having, commitments on financial regulation or on fossil fuel phase out, potentially might be part of the NCQG, but there has been a lot of pushback by many developing countries about not dealing with 2.1c there and focusing the NCQG just on the international support flows. So it'll be an important process to watch. Whatever's in the NCQG, there's going to be some other follow-up needed on 2.1c. And I think the reason that's important is that even if we were to scale up international climate finance under the NCQG to the $1 trillion level, if we don't address the broader alignment of finance flows, including the need to phase out financing for fossil fuels, the need to bring in financial regulation around the world in developed and developing countries to ensure that finance is flowing to climate action and not to things that are undermining climate action, we will not hit Paris goals. These are 2 sides of the same coin. We need to be scaling up finance for the good stuff, but also shifting away from financing for the bad stuff. So I think that a lot of that is probably going to happen post NCQG. And hopefully the air can be cleared once the NCQG is agreed to actually have a more more fruitful discussion on 2.1c. And then finally, outside the UNFCCC process, we already mentioned a little bit about MDB reform, about the IMF reform as well, the way that debt is dealt with in the G20 and other processes. These are critical, and I think that one of the things is that the NCQG, as Avantika said, is sort of a framework, and it's setting goals, it's setting ambition, and a sort of a mental model for how we think about finance and climate action. But the actual delivery channels, a lot of those are going to be outside what the COP has and the CMA have direct influence over. A lot of it will be through MDBs, through national development finance institutions, through the IMF, through the G20. And so I think it's really important to sort of keep an eye on those processes. It's the same governments that are shareholders there. And there has been a lot of work in recent years to get the MDBs to reform and unlock more capital, was already mentioned. They've made some good progress, but there's still quite a lot of money left on the table, so to speak. That the G20 commissioned an independent review of MDB's capital adequacy frameworks, and then there was another G20 independent expert group on strengthening multilateral development banks. If you take those two reports together, they set out a number of reform proposals, including capital increases to pledges to the MDB's non-concessional windows, and then going further on capital adequacy. So, using the existing capital base and squeezing more out of it. And they, the independent expert group suggested that you could triple MDB's annual financing to 390 billion a year by 2030. And if you assume that roughly half of MDB's overall financing these days is going towards climate-related action, that means that MDBs alone could be doing $195 billion per year in climate finance if you undertook all these reforms. So that's a huge amount, almost a doubling of the 100 billion of itself before you start looking at other sources. But these changes are not guaranteed. They're going to require concerted efforts by government. So I think it's, the UNFCCC can set the ambition, can set the target, can focus minds, but the actual delivery, and this was the same with the 100 billion, will come outside of the process largely. And so it's going to be important to take whatever goals are agreed and then use them as the impetus for further reform of the broader financial institution system.
Great, thanks, Joe. That was really helpful, and again, kind of reinstates that there's multiple things happening out there, but it sounds like the NCQG is kind of the lever on which everything might just turn going forward. So I'm aware that we're kind of already running about 10 minutes over time, so I want to maybe just ask a couple of quick wrap-up questions. Recognizing the importance of the NCQG, Avantika, could you maybe just very quickly tell us, noting that the discussions span everything from a floor of 100 billion to something in potentially the trillions, but getting huge amounts from bilateral sources is probably not particularly feasible right now. What outcome would count as a success in your mind?
We have a set of principles that we've put forth in our position paper that we think would guide an ambitious outcome at COP29. And I think the idea is, I guess they say aim for the stars and you'll get something in between. I don't know if that's the saying, but that's the spirit of what I'm trying to convey. There are a set of demands on the table from developing countries, from developing countries' civil society organizations, and of course, allies in the developed world. And I think as many of those demands that make their way into the final decision text of the NCQG, I think that would really count as a success. So in terms of quantum, there are various estimates floating around, but essentially the quantum has to be in line with the needs of developing countries, and it has to be new and additional over and above existing aid commitments of developed countries. The quality of finance really cannot worsen indebtedness in the developing world. The priority should be on, as mentioned earlier, grant-based, highly concessional finance with a driving force coming through international public finance and the private sector kind of playing a supporting role, because the mobilization component tends to lack predictability and accountability. And I think the very sticky contributor base debate, our point of view is that expanding the contributor base is not an issue that can be resolved within the timeline of COP29, and it definitely should not stall the flow of funds due to developing countries 2025 onwards. This goes against the mandate of the NCQG. There is a legal obligation of developed countries to provide financial resources to developing countries. This should be the premise of the NCQG outcome. However, if any such expansion has to be agreed upon, it has to be via a multilaterally negotiated set of criteria, which can be commenced 2025 onwards. So we've made some recommendations about this in our paper, but it has to be something that is agreed upon by that has buy-in from developing countries, essentially. So I think that's the set of principles that are guiding our view of the NCQG outcome. And as many of these get fulfilled, that will really serve to then enable that climate ambition that is required.
Great, thank you, Avantika. I'm quite keen for us to come to the audience Q&A very soon, but just to give a space for some closing thoughts, maybe I'll just come to Joe quickly and then to Jonathan with the same question. Which is, what are the implications on global climate cooperation if the quantum isn't seen as sufficient? So if you could just answer that very briefly, Joe, and kind of close out with any final thoughts you might have.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, yeah, climate finance is, as often mentioned, the grand bargain that underpinned the Paris Agreement, the idea that all countries need to do much more to tackle the climate crisis, but poorer and more vulnerable countries who've done least to cause the problem and are hit first and worst by the impacts will need support from richer countries to do so. I think the other thing to say is that trust between developed and developing countries is at the lowest point in recent memory. That's partly due to the delay on the 100 billion, but also the broader geopolitical developments that have happened outside the convention. The vaccine delivery and the inequity around that, the economic fallout from COVID, the wars in Ukraine and the Middle East, diverting attention, but also illustrating that mobilization of financial resources is possible. And then, the slow, poorly coordinated responses to the sovereign debt crisis, cuts to development aid. There's a long list of problems and sets not a great backdrop for these negotiations. I think agreeing an ambitious and achievable NCQG is actually vital to prove the naysayers wrong, to reinvigorate the spirit of Paris and to rebuild trust. And a goal that sends a clear signal about increased climate investments can actually give confidence to leaders to commit their countries to stronger emissions reduction targets and enable them to better deal with climate impacts. And that's super important this year because all countries are being asked to submit updated nationally determined contributions by February next year. So, urgently scaling funding is essential for the transition. It's an enabler of ambition to meet the Paris Agreement goals and avoid the far greater future global cost of unchecked climate change. And so, if we don't deliver, and if we don't bring all countries along on this transition, it will have ramifications beyond those countries. I think that's one of the mistakes that often gets made, is to think that you can kind of isolate yourself in the rich world. But we've seen with COVID, we've seen with wars, and and how both of those have sort of affected supply chains, have led to further instability and economic upheaval. The failure to sort of ensure a safe and just transition will have ramifications for global economic stability and security. So I think that's really what's at stake here.
Thanks, Joe. Yep, that sounds very important indeed. Jonathan, any closing comments or anything to add over here, please?
Yeah, just quickly. I mean, I would very much agree with what Joe has just said. You know, it is critically important. Just in a very brief aside, I did some brief analysis last year trying to quantify what the impact of the promise of climate finance, not necessarily the provision, but the promise of climate finance might be as something that underpins the Paris Agreement and is important towards influencing the ambition that countries apply when setting their own NDCs. And the bottom line was that with pretty conservative assumptions, I estimated that the indirect impact of climate finance was potentially 10 times bigger than the direct impact of climate finance invested in mitigation programs, for example, because it is just so important in ensuring a collective commitment to reducing emissions, which ultimately is what is needed. So I totally agree with Joe that this is absolutely critically important that we reach an agreement. I'm skeptical that it will be anything like as ambitious as developing countries rightly wish it to be. That's just being realistic. I'm hopeful that there will be, nevertheless, an acknowledgement that whatever is agreed will be sufficiently larger than what we have on the table to allow an agreement to be met. I think we've done some work suggesting that, you know, just with existing inflation and growth projections, a doubling of the target would effectively be no ambition at all, or no increased ambition at all. So anything agreed must be substantially larger than that. I'm also hopeful, and I emphasize the word hopeful rather than optimistic, that there will at least be an acknowledgement that there is a role for the richer, more heavily polluting non-traditional donors to start contributing in some fashion. It strikes me that that is just essential if there is to be an agreement going forward. And I guess a key point is that this sort of very binary distinction between developed and developing countries is actually not helping us right now. It really isn't helping us. And there are plenty of genuinely very poor developing countries where, personally, I'll be very candid, I'm mystified to a degree as to why they are not encouraging greater effort and action from those much better off, much more heavily polluting countries, emerging economies that are as responsible as many others. That's if anybody has answered that question, I would love to hear them. But I think, you know, there is the basis for a deal. It won't satisfy everybody by any means, but I think the very fact that the growing scale and urgency of the climate problem is just becoming more and more apparent means that something will be agreed at COP29, even if it's only the first instalment in what the final NCQG would end up looking like. That's my hope, at any rate. But back to you, Aman.
Thank you, Jonathan. Ending on a message of hope as always. But that kind of concludes our discussion round, and I know we're at time now, but maybe we can just take 5 or 7 minutes running through a few quick audience questions. Maybe, and we've tried clustering the questions a little bit, but I think we've seen, in the chat box, there are broadly 3 questions right now on the uses of the NCQG and climate finance overall. Maybe I'll just come to them first. One is from Rana Pujari, who's asking if there's any way to channel international finance, including NCQG, to subnational players. There's one question that speaks about capacity building at the national and local levels, and what percentage of climate finance will be allocated towards this. And one question on the ways in which grassroots communities that are in need of finance, the ways in which they're engaged in these high-level decisions. So speaking about some of the stakeholders and users of finance on the ground, Avantika, can I volunteer you for this, or would somebody else like to put their hand up?
I'll defer to someone else for this question.
I can have a go. I mean, I think that you know, it like one of the problems with sort of these high level negotiating processes is that they aren't terribly accessible. You know, even as someone from a developed country nonprofit, they you know, if you're not a government, you frequently get excluded from the ability to sit in on the negotiations. There are efforts, and I know that the UNFCCC this year has made a lot of effort to sort of rebalance the badge allocation for observers to include more badges for the Global South. You know, but it's still a challenge for like local groups to get the funding and the ability to go and attend. And then, you know, even once you're there, the ability to sort of influence is mixed. I think one of the challenges as well is sort of that this is a state-based negotiation process, and national governments are pretty, you know, across the board, developed and developing, pretty jealously guard their sovereignty. And so when there have been efforts, particularly in the multilateral climate funds, to develop mechanisms that give grants directly to local communities, this is something that's actively being discussed in the loss and damage fund negotiations on how to set that fund up. The climate investment funds have a dedicated grant mechanism for indigenous peoples. The adaptation fund has direct access. The GCF has direct access as well. There are a few examples of sort of more locally rooted NGOs being able to access those funds, but it's not easy. And there's a lot more that could be done. But I think it's going to require a real willingness on the part of governments of recipient countries, of developing countries, to actually be to accommodate that as well. And you know, I also understand why they would have concerns about if you you know, like if you go straight to a community group, a lot of increasingly a lot of development aid is doing that, but the national government then is like, well, we need to have a sense of what's going on, what's happening in our country, where finance is flowing. So it does get tricky, but I think there are solutions to that. I think the commitments around, for example, locally led adaptation are a good way to sort of get institutions, at least on paper, committed to that. But then the actual delivery is more challenging. But I think it's one that's really going to require making access to local communities to these negotiations more easy, to the proceeds of the fund boards, lowering the barriers to sort of apply for funding, and then on developed countries' part, they're going to have to be more relaxed about local groups aren't going to be able to meet as all the sort of paperwork and fiduciary standards and all the sort of like requirements maybe to the same level that, say, the World Bank could. And so trying to tailor the provisions and the accreditation requirements and the project application requirements, making them fit for purpose. And that's something the GCF was always, was trying to do, of sort of having different thresholds, different amounts of paperwork required for like different levels of risks, different sizes of projects. So if you're going for a smaller project, which is less risky, you don't need to submit hundreds and hundreds of pages of application materials. But again, there's a lot of talk about all of that. It's easier said than done, and the progress has been pretty slow.
Thanks, Joe. I think we have maybe one or two other questions in the chat boxes about the relationship between the NCQG and loss and damage finance, the role of private finance, which all of you kind of mentioned in your comments, but just about how it's included, whether it's included, mobilization, and so on. And this question on again, one of the sub-questions on the uses of the NCQG towards channeling finance towards subnational players such as state governments or towards capacity building. So just any maybe closing thoughts on any of these points, and I think we will hopefully have covered most of the big picture comments.
And chip in if you like, Aman.
Please.
Well, I think the idea that the NCQG should establish sub-targets for different elements of funding, mitigation, adaptation in particular, I think is really, really important. I know the commitment to double adaptation finance at Glasgow was felt by many to be a significant achievement, and that was a step in the right direction. Most people, I think, would feel that more needs to be spent on adaptation, and having more explicit targets, I think, would be positive. The loss and damage one is extremely contentious. Part of me, if I'm honest, thinks that loss and damage would almost be better off outside of this process altogether, because it is a separate category. I prefer to see it as a separate category that requires and is justified by its own funding arrangements. But I think the majority view is that no, we need something that will embrace loss and damage within the NCQG. My simple worry about that is that whatever sum is determined for the NCQG will then just have to be spread even more thinly across three different elements: adaptation, mitigation, and loss and damage, which I worry would be unfortunate and counterproductive. But I know that's a hot topic. On the question about channeling to subnationals, yes, I think in the principle of trying to meet recipient needs, that will often be a desirable way to go. I think it comes back to my points about aid effectiveness and the lessons we have learned from that, and the desirability of having more programmatic forms of support that basically channel finance towards nationally owned and led climate change action plans that address both mitigation and adaptation. They could be separated. And then the extent to which subnational levels of government are involved in that will be a function of how effective decentralization processes are in those countries. I think it'd be risky to try and engineer or create such processes which don't already exist. We shouldn't let the climate finance drive that. It needs to be more of an internal political process that pushes subnationally led development. But for sure, there is desirability in seeing climate finance channeled to those lower levels. But that would be my response to those questions. As I say, I thank you for this opportunity to speak at this. I remain maybe not optimistic, but hopeful.
Which I think is the most any of us can hope for. So if there are no more comments from Avantika, Joe, we're already 10 minutes over time. So I'm happy. Oh, Joe, sorry, you have your hand up. Go for it.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I want to say on loss and damage is that, it's often pointed out by developed countries that loss and damage is not referenced in Article 9, and the strict reading of the NCQG mandate would suggest it falls outside. And it's a stance that is legally right but morally tone deaf, and that's not necessarily going to serve the interests of developed countries well, particularly because it's the most vulnerable countries who are calling for dealing with loss and damage in the NCQG. So I'm not sure if you would get you can get a quantitative goal for loss and damage. I think there's a strong precedent for a new quantified adaptation goal. The Glasgow doubling, it only goes to 2025. Developed countries have shown that they're able to commit to that, and so I think we really need to push and say, come on, you should renew that in some shape and form. But I think at least qualitative language on loss and damage that could call for scale up of provision of funding, including contributions to the fund for responding to loss and damage and other funding arrangements. But then I think also one of the things that gets sometimes a little bit lost in the loss and damage funding debate is it kind of forgets how much loss and damage funding is going to be related to how well we do on mitigation and adaptation. And so I think a really important provision should be to acknowledge that greater mitigation and adaptation efforts will mean less loss and damage, and linking it back, you know, as was pointed out earlier, that all of these issues are connected, but linking back mitigate the loss and damage finance to how good the next round of NDCs are, and how good the support for mitigation and adaptation is, because, you know, if we fail on mitigation and on adaptation, there is no amount of money that is going to be able to cover the loss and damage needs. And I think that often gets lost in the loss and damage finance debate, that it kind of, I take Jonathan's point of, like, you know, keeping it separate because spreading funding too thinly, but I think also there's an argument of, like, connecting them, because if we keep it separate, there's a way of thinking about loss and damage that makes it just seem like it's this abstract separate thing living on its own, and it's not. It's highly dependent on how well we do on mitigation and adaptation. So thank you.
Thanks, Joe, and really important perspectives from both of you. Avantika, if you could just offer some brief comments, please.
Yes, very brief. I was wondering if I had 2 minutes to get in a word on the private finance question, and I'll wrap up very quickly. So I think absolutely, as Nehal has highlighted, the private capital mobilization, particularly for the green transition, particularly in developing countries, has been extremely underwhelming. The best estimates, and I'm citing, I mean, sources for all of this are available in our paper, but the best estimates for mobilization have been found to be 70 cents of private investment for $1 of public investment so far. So not exactly billions to trillions yet. In terms of public-private partnerships, there's a new book coming out by an economist, James Lakeland, who I'm sure many of you are aware of, which states that data for public-private partnerships in infrastructure and development in developing countries actually peaked in 2012 at $158 billion and has since then halved to $86 billion in 2023. And additionally, institutional investors like pension funds actually invest the least amount of money in developing countries, where they have a share of less than 1% of their investment. So the data shows that private investment in developing countries for climate and development isn't really happening to that extent. There's a lot of work that is being done, I would say, outside of the space of UNFCCC and the civil society and negotiators that operate there, in the wider research community, on kind of critically analyzing this private capital mobilization question. And there are some genuine, very good faith proposals out there which are talking about addressing currency risk, addressing the question of credit rating agencies and the role that they play. So proposals for having a public credit rating agency, or even there's African civil societies coming up with an African credit rating agency proposal for their own subset. There are proposals out there to kind of rechannel special drawing rights towards certain financial entities to then help bring in private capital. There's also for developing countries, I think one thing that's very critical, and this is something that CSE advocates for, is to come up with clear bottom-up sectoral decarbonization pathways that can then act as signals to international investors and financiers to then provide financing for those pathways. And I think some developing countries are proactive, but a lot of the global south is kind of hesitant to show too much ambition without getting commitments of those finance in. But the next NDC cycle is going to be interesting for this, because there is a growing narrative that the next generation of NDCs should essentially act as investment plans, where countries should put out proper costed pathways that then international financiers can then look to invest in. Again, in reality, a lot of this doesn't work out because private capital is driven by their duty to their shareholders, and they need to turn a profit and all of that. So we don't know how much of this is going to work, but there's definitely some good conversations happening. I think all of it has to be approached with a lot of caution and with a very critical eye, and not kind of an overwhelming sense of like, this is all going to be great and this is the silver bullet. So yeah, just my 2 cents on that.
Thanks, Avantika. Really helpful to know. I mean, we were kind of battling over here between a need for kind of faster progress at more scaled up levels, while maintaining levels of caution around what's happening where. We've already spilled about 15 minutes over time, but this has been a fascinating discussion, and it's provided so much insight into not just the NCQG, but also everything else that's happening within COP, as well as what's happening outside of COP through other channels. And hopefully this gives our audience kind of some useful takeaways into how to approach this very complicated, very diverse landscape. But let me stop here and thank you all very much for your time and for your thoughts, Jonathan, Avantika, Joe, and my thanks to the audience for listening in. So we can stop here and have a wonderful evening, afternoon, morning, etc. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Okay.
much.
Thanks all. Bye-bye.